I still see giggles in the office when I talk about cannabis, and there's still a lot of stoner jokes being made amongst my peers, whereas it's taken a lot more seriously in North America. I mean, there's still a lot of that stoner culture, but it's not as it's starting to work its way out as it's become the social norm.
From both sides of the pond, Rebecca Allen-Tapp is Business Development Manager at Asahi Glassworks UK. Based in England but originally from the US, she's worked in cannabis on both sides of the Atlantic. Let's get her take on the similarities, differences, challenges and opportunities of working in an increasingly complex international industry.
Welcome, Rebecca. Nice to see you. Thanks for joining me. So do you want to start by telling the listeners or the viewers out there a little bit about yourself and where you are and where you're from and what you're doing, and we'll go from there.
Of course. So I'm Rebecca Allen-Tapp. I'm originally a West Coaster, a Pacific Northwest native of America. I recently moved over to the UK to work for a company in Royston, which is in between Cambridge and London. My background is in the cannabis industry, and I'm also a patient, so I'm bringing a lot of that both professional and personal background over here to really make some change in the market.
Cool. So again, I think the first question on, well, everyone's mind or just mine is like, what's the connection between being in Royston and I think you're working for a Japanese glassworks company, isn't it? And the cannabis sector. How does that all kind of fit together? Because it's not immediately obvious to me, at least. So how what you're doing is all relates back to the cannabis sector.
Of course. So I work for a global family of brands. So although our headquarters, the parent company, is in Japan, we have sites in the U.S., in New Jersey, in India, in also in the UK, and a spot in Switzerland as well. So each of them specializes in their own area of expertise, but most of them are involved in glass. So our facility in the UK, we are glass and also flow chemistry, and our glass equipment is used in processing environments.
Cool. So it's kind of to do with sort of chemistry and things like that. So you're kind of coming from it very much from the cannabis angle, but the company you're working with are very much in the sort of production of the instruments that can be used to create cannabis products. That's kind of the connection. Is that kind of right? And how does that all work? I mean,
they're in the process. So what their space is, they create the equipment used for various applications, from pharmaceutical development or for chemicals. They can use the tools for a lot of different applications. And historically, they really didn't get too involved too much on the application side, as far as their equipment was really made for several different applications. But now that I'm on board, we have our first really channel-driven application, which is cannabis, and that's an area we're focusing on so that we can actually configure our equipment for cannabis production.
So is that quite a tricky process? Is that really different to what the company is already doing? And why cannabis? Just because it's a sector that's kind of untapped? Is there a lot of potential, do you think, here in the UK?
Yeah, so the tools that they had are already great for the cannabis workflow. We have rotary evaporators, which is great for solvent recovery. We have distillation systems for making distillate, which would then go into a vape cartridge. And we also have filter reactors made for making CBD isolate. So basically what we're doing is taking existing systems that are used within standard chemistry applications and configuring them specifically for cannabis.
Cool.
So just making some small tweaks and changes.
So the companies that you're sort of working with, predominantly sort of UK based, and again, it's just kind of, I mean, for the people sort of listening, I mean, I don't know how much they'll know about sort of medical cannabis in the UK, as well as kind of CBD orientated products. I think they're more and more sort of prevalent over here. Have you seen? I mean, not unlike the US. Well, very different to the US in many respects. But I mean, having come from the West Coast and then coming to England, I mean, what's your kind of perception on how mature the sector is over here, the cannabis sector?
Yeah, so from an equipment standpoint, I'll speak to that first. I had the pleasure of working with AGI UK, who I'm with right now. AGI UK, both in America and with the North American market prior to coming over here. So I got to see the different levels of processing in the market. I think one of the biggest differences between here and the US and Canada is GMP. It's really not as big of a deal in America or in the US at least to have GMP as it is in the UK and Europe. And I think that's because here it's still a medical culture, whereas the recreational culture has kind of defined the new rules for processing.
And just to be clear, what do you mean exactly by GMP?
Good manufacturing practices. So it's the process that facilities have to go through to ensure that they are making safe for consumption material. So say that they had something like an outbreak of some sort of pathogen or maybe some sort of aspergillus or something, they would have to go back through and trace through their process to see where the contamination came from. So it's really heavy on documentation and making sure that the processes are followed, that you have cleaning procedures in place, and that you have a lot of documentation on your equipment. So heavy onto material traceability and such. So it's a process.
Yeah, but there's still, there's quite a lot to go into that. But you said you think that obviously the focus here is kind of on CBD and medical in the UK, but in the US, with kind of recreational being in certain states so widely available, just the culture, the attitudes in terms of how you can do business, that must feel very different here.
It is because here it's still so taboo to talk about.
Yes,
definitely. It's different to talk about it here from that standpoint of like acceptance. I still see giggles in the office when I talk about cannabis, and there's still a lot of stoner jokes being made amongst my peers, whereas it's taken a lot more seriously in North America. There's still a lot of that stoner culture, but it's not as it's starting to work its way out as it's become the social norm. So like the other day I was at the CBD show, and the CBD market is so much different than the medical market. But there was so much there. What looked like the advertising looked like it was like geared towards kids, a lot of like giant gummies and people in suits, like walking around like foam mascots. It was really interesting to see that just the two different cultures. I usually like to go to medical shows to kind of see how the market has two different faces and how the that small separating defining factor is THC content,
Right. Okay. No, that it's a surprise, but it's not a surprise at the same time. I think that's how I look at it. That kind of.
That's true. It's more of a disappointment, right?
It's weird. Again, I remember. I might have said this on previous shows that I've done. The idea that I think I went to a show just before pandemic, early 2020, and it was CBD and Hemp Expo in Birmingham. And again, just the kind of aesthetic that you see from the different types of companies there. You've got this very sort of chemical, like, Mile High Labs kind of distillate stuff. Then you've got kind of, infused cosmetics, which wouldn't look out of place in, Selfridges or something like that, in like a London or New York sort of department store. And then you have, they were kind of like cash and carry, kind of selling giant skull bongs and massive, papers. And it was CBD orientated, but it was kind of like the one thing they weren't saying was that, some people will use this for kind of THC content too. And that was still at a time. Sorry?
I said, yeah, I agree.
Yeah. It's very strange. But again, it just shows that there isn't the same, I won't say reverence. Maybe reverence is the word that, perhaps the cannabis sector gets over here compared to the US. And again, I haven't been to the US in quite a while to kind of compare what it's like, but hopefully I'll get to change that soon. But again, get the impression from people I speak to like yourself that, again, the market maturity, it's interesting that you've got certain states like California and Colorado that have been, are kind of like the OG states or whatever, they've been doing it for so long, medical, recreational, whatever. And then you've got new states just opening up, like, New York, New Jersey, New Mexico. It's and how are they going to kind of adapt as well, culturally and from a kind of standpoint of, what does it mean to be, have recreational cannabis now available?
Yeah.
I'm not sure what the answer is.
Right.
It's just speculation, you know.
I mean, it's definitely progressive there. I mean, currently 1 in 3 Americans live in a state where recreational cannabis is legal. You know, so
it's East and West Coast, and the closer you get to the middle, the less sort of accepted it seems, or at least from a legal standpoint.
Exactly. I mean, and then California and Washington had their developed, and I think it was California had their medical program developed in 1996, and then Washington was right after it with Oregon in 1998. So, and then they were some of the first to legalize as well. So they've had a lot of time to really test out these pilot programs, whereas a lot of the rest of the world is kind of coming online with the CBD market at the same time as the medicinal cannabis market. And it's just, I think it's a little confusing for consumers. So there's a lot of smoke and mirrors happening on both sides of the industry. And I think it's because they're kind of emerging at that same time without having these really developed programs.
And I think you and I have sort of spoken before about the idea that, well, how do you kind of create a sort of culture, a program around, acceptance or just availability? And again, that can look different in Germany versus the UK. I mean, I think most people still don't know, medicinal cannabis is available here in the UK, and things like that. And again, there are certain things happening policy-wise to kind of change that. I know there's organizations like the CIC that are working to change that and sort of raise the profile. But again, it just isn't, the awareness just isn't there. And how do you change that? And how do you broaden that awareness? I mean, what's been your experience? I mean, having been to like a few expos, both in the UK, Europe, and I guess in North America as well, in terms of what the kind of appetite for, I guess, THC content is, in a legal environment. I find it's just, from what I can tell, people are either open to it or they're not. And if they're not, then there's always a bit of this is still quite dodgy. Like you say, people don't discuss it. It's still taboo. And how do you break through those taboos? I know there's no easy answer, but what have you seen effective, I guess?
Well, I mean, a lot of my mission here is to educate and raise awareness. And a lot of that's because of my own personal background in cannabis, both professionally and personally, right? So I think it's having open conversations, and I think a lot of that's also going to come like the THC fear mongering is the real only antidote for that is expanding medical programs, really getting into the science, like working with people like Drug Science and Project 2021 and the plea community, where you can really get some evidence-based information rather than just, what we're seeing from around the world. So I don't believe there can be a thriving recreational market without a medical market. So I think really putting some focus into that space, education, awareness, advocacy is where we need to invest our time and energy.
No, absolutely. I think what have you seen? How do you think do you think brands have a responsibility to do that as much as kind of like, you do? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if you go on, like, for instance, like as a UK like user, like if you go on and you see the brands that are available for medical patients to use. I mean, I'm speaking about cannabis specifically, not CBD, but with that, I don't feel like there's enough education going out about their product, about how it's used, about how it's dosed. And I feel like it's just kind of brand recognition by more like by symbol and by social media, and maybe sponsorship at shows, less by actual, by way of like educational content, and patient outreach. There seems to be a lot of producers on the market that aren't heavily geared towards marketing to the patient and educating their patients, rather than focusing on physicians. And I think that's where there's an issue,
do you mean like there's not enough marketing to physicians, or there's too much? Or?
I think there's too much marketing to like clinics and physicians, but not in the right space, like not in the space of education, where here's what our product does, here's some of the science on it, maybe some workshops. There seems to be more just like trying to do like brand loyalty.
Right. Okay. So it's more about this is, you can trust us rather than, here's what we're able to offer for different conditions or.
Exactly. It's more like we're a big North American brand that owns, X amount of companies.
Yeah. No names mentioned. Yeah. And,
instead of really, of course, right? Instead of trying to really focus on developing relationships with patients and also with physicians that are, or clinics, even, people who are really working towards talking to the patients and talking to consumers.
Do you think brands will speak directly or should be speaking directly to consumers? Or do you think they need to go through the sort of legitimate inverted commas channels of like a physician or a clinic? And you think so is it enabling the medical professionals to be able to extol the virtues of medical cannabis to patients? Or do you think brands have an opportunity to just, legitimize the whole industry to kind of get to patients? And they need to do that directly. I mean, it's an interesting route to market.
Yeah, I think that it's going to happen probably regardless if they're with the way that we that brands market themselves, because a lot of it's on social media, right? And plus they need patients to be able to request their product. I think that a lot of times that's how they're going to get access to the medicine they need is by developing brand awareness and then requesting that type of product based on the values of the company and whatever they find that they're in alignment with.
I mean, I find it quite interesting as someone who's always lived here in the UK that, there would be kind of brand recognition around kind of pharmaceuticals, for want of a better term. I mean, obviously you have kind of like, brands like, paracetamol, aspirin brands and things like that.
Yeah.
And, it's like, but it's still, there are still generic alternatives to that. And I guess in North America, it's much more commercialized compared to the UK, right?
It is, definitely. Yeah.
And the whole idea of sort of there being a sort of brand awareness of a particular, well, are we talking about as a particular cannabis strain? I mean, I guess a lot of medical companies still use kind of street names, don't they, to kind of talk about strains, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, I would think more like company, like someone that I had, like, especially if I have a cultivator that I like that has specific growing practices or, certain ethos, then I'd want to use their product, I think that's what's important is that connection.
Yeah, but I think it still feels, I mean, from the outside looking in almost, it still feels like we're a long way from being able to do that. I think maybe that's part, I don't know if there's a supply chain issue, because I think by and large, from what I understand here in the UK, because of the way, medical cannabis enters the market, it's a sort of supply and demand issue. And a lot of patients are only able to access what's on offer. And that is not through the black market or, through the illicit market, but from, the mainstream legal market too, which I think's, again, to put you on the spot, but I think that's my understanding. And I think in that environment, you have a tricky kind of.
Yeah, it is limited. And also I think, not only is our products limited, but I think the other issue is that, that it's all cannabis in the UK that's done, that goes through medical cannabis has to go through the private route. So you have extra hoops to jump through, and then you're not going to have any financial support with obtaining that prescription. So you have to go through, the process of speaking with your GP and then going and getting, finding a clinic and then getting a prescription and all these steps. But then there's associated cost with all of that as well. Like the cost of product here is so much more expensive than in the US, especially, if someone, because in the US, there's no incentive anymore to really, yes, there's no incentive. The incentive to be a medical patient is lower, just because of availability and ease of obtaining your own medicine nearby, right? I had 5 dispensaries near my house within walking distance when in Oregon, and a wide variety of products. But here it's much more limited. And then there's, a process that you have to go through and a cost, you have to weigh.
Mm-hmm. But I know a lot more kind of, I guess, North American brands like, cookies, recreational brands are trying to find a sort of foothold here in Europe and in the UK particular. And I think the only way they can do that is through kind of, brand awareness and perhaps entering the CBD market and things like that, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple big players that have gotten over onto the medical cannabis market as well. Okay. But yeah, I think it's also that a lot of them are just priming themselves for eventual recreational stuff.
Yeah.
Like they know it's going to come eventually. It's just when the question is when, and I think that's kind of the $1 million question. Yeah. So I think they're just trying to prepare. And the U.S. is definitely not shy when it comes to their marketing ideas with cannabis. So it's easy to get kind of like global recognition. Yes. So if you've ever been to MJ Biz, which I know that Jill Reddish spoke about on her last session with you, MJ Biz is one of the biggest trade shows in the world for cannabis. And I think it has up to 35,000 attendees or something nuts like that. Wow. And so I think there's no shortage of the marketing that comes out of the U.S. cannabis machine. Yeah,
that's it. But again, it's just curious. But at the same time, setting the groundwork for an eventual something that we don't know when it might happen. But I suppose it's similar in the U.S. Really. I mean, you've got certain states, but at the same time, there's no federal legalization. So it's a case of, well, when will that happen? And I think some companies, is it Canopy Growth have decided they're going to buy one of brands like the gummies brand out of Colorado when recreational cannabis becomes legal. But it's a big when, but it's a case of, well, we've got this check for however many million. We'll give it to you when it happens or something. I'm sure it's a lot more complex than that, but it's like, wow, that's kind of putting your money where your mouth is. But again, it's contingent on a when, which is was curious. But again, it just shows that there's some people making a lot of money and they see a lot of potential in the market, which is, well, it's fantastic, really. But it just makes it extra complicated and convoluted in many respects.
Yeah, well, and I think that's kind of been a question that's on a lot of our minds, kind of, especially as an American, when are we going to legalize it? And the MORE Act did just recently pass through the House of Representatives for the second time. It's not expected to pass Senate, but it does address some key issues in the cannabis market, including scheduling, safe access to banking, and cannabis-related convictions. Mm-hmm. So that is definitely showing that there's progress being made in the United States. I think that my hope is that if nothing else, we see it rescheduled in the near future. If that's the very least, if they at least reschedule it, because right now it's a class 1, or it's a Schedule 1 substance, and it has been since 1970. That puts it up there with heroin, cocaine, methamphetamines. It makes it so the DEA currently labels it as not currently acceptable for medical use. So even by rescheduling it to a Schedule 2, then physicians would be able to prescribe it and scientists would be able to use it for research. So we'd at least have more information on the potential harms and benefits of cannabis.
But that's just in the US. I mean, obviously it's different in Europe, but is it a similar situation to your understanding in that the way that it's scheduled means that it can't be actively used in the same way for research and, become a bit more available to kind of go through those sort of checks, if you like?
Yeah, I think so it's a class B here instead of a class A. Mm-hmm. So that gives it a little bit more freedom.
Yeah. It was class C, I remember that much in the UK. And then Gordon Brown retracted it in all his infinite wisdom or something. And that was his one claim to fame or something like that. That's all he was. Anyway, enough about the politics. But I think you're right. Again, the either class A drugs and class B drugs and things like that.
So I think it's going to take me a little bit more time to really understand how the research system works here. I mean, a lot of it is obviously it's political. Yeah. They were just going to launch that medical pilot program, it was going to be at 5,000 patients. And I think now it's been a day ago, they announced that was going to be drastically rolled back as far as amount of participants, just because the conversation surrounding the program itself. So I think that just there's some more work to be done as far as allowing it to be was seen as beneficial for research and those kind of purposes.
Yeah, no, it's almost feels like, you know, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or vice versa. You know, it's you know, there's a willingness there, but when it comes to the crunch, it's like, well, maybe we should just scale back and, you know, hold back on what we're doing because we're not sure, and it just feels like that just seems to add unnecessary time and to any sort of meaningful.
Exactly. Well, and like we need to shift the focus from drug misuse as to a health issue instead of a criminal issue, and focus on like harm reduction. You know, I think that there's just it's still so demonized.
Yes. No, absolutely. And again, when there's tangible health benefits, and it's a case of, well, what can we say? What can we legitimately say? And, you know, based on the science, and what can't we say? And again, that plays a factor in it. But no, I mean, it'd be interesting if you don't mind telling us a little bit about your own story and your own use of cannabis from medical perspective, because that's quite a unique one, isn't it? Are you happy to sort of share that? You sort of hinted at it, so I'm just playing. I'm guessing that's okay.
Yeah, no, definitely. That's part of the reason I came over here, was to add my story to the collective voice and for change, right? So, I mean, I've been using cannabis for as long as I can remember. I mean, not obviously like, you know, like not in my teen years. As a young adult, a lot for anxiety and for other issues. And it's always been really, really beneficial for me. I like to tell people that my husband says I have a lot of tabs open in my mind. So for me, it helps me to kind of close the tabs and just feel a little bit more calm and collected. And then more recently, about a little over 3 years ago, I was diagnosed with a really rare cancer, neuroendocrine cancer. It was in my lung. They found about a golf ball sized tumor that had been growing for anywhere between 10 to 15 years by the time they actually found it.
Wow.
And I relied heavily on cannabis to help me with my pain management after my surgery. I worked with a local farm in Oregon called East Fork Cultivars, and their educational representative, Anna, came by and actually went over how to use tinctures to help relieve my pain. So I did about the first day home on my actual prescribed pain meds, and then from every day on used only tinctures to help with my pain management. And I mean, I healed very quickly. So, you know, from such a major surgery. So, it's been quite the journey. And then ever since then, it's helped me with, you know, all the secondary issues that have arisen from having had my lung removed, such as like I've developed secondary disorders, like neuropathic issues and chronic pain and chronic fatigue. So it really helps me have just as much of an ordinary life as possible and a good quality of life, because otherwise there are days that I cannot get out of bed. But it helps me to not get in my head about that, to have a regular work day and then get done and be a mom and have the time for all those things. Which otherwise, if I didn't have a solution like that, I don't know what I would turn to help with the various ailments. I feel like I'd be on just 10 to 15 prescriptions or supplements to try to do what one thing is doing for me. And I've also had the pleasure of being very open with my medical team, my oncologist, my pulmonologist. Everyone knows, I mean, obviously before I came over to the UK, starting over from scratch, but my entire team was on board with what I was doing and very supportive. So it's been an interesting road.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that. I mean, just such a powerful story, and it makes you just think, I mean, when I was speaking to, I think in the first podcast, Xavier Clark, who runs Patient 11, has got the advocacy group for, people on the UK cannabis register, just hearing about the amount of just the alternatives to what, the prescription medication that cannabis has kind of prevented, or, I think it was on something like, again, a similar sort of concoction of prescription medications, and, all but 2 of them could be managed by, medical cannabis. And that's, again, it makes you think, well, people need, medicines needs to wake up to this, but how do you do that? And again, when you talk about the, the scheduling and how available that makes it, and again, social stigmas, there's just a big kind of mess of, so many things to kind of overcome. It's like just being able to kind of tell those stories and, and provide that research. It's a combination of both, isn't it? It's the sort of qualitative and quantitative aspects of the data and the stories that all go alongside that. And that is what's going to help sort of change those stigmas and be able to, that's kind of a little bit what we're doing here, but again, helping tell those stories and, extol the virtues, and I think that's, again, for most people don't see that, or they hear about it and they think, oh, well, good. I think one of the things Xavier Clark has said to me, like, when he talks to people about, his usage, people always go, oh, well, I'm glad it works for you, sort of patronizingly. And again, it's when you think about the amount of people who could benefit from medical cannabis, it's, well, for everything from anxiety to, more significant conditions that need to be maintained long term. It's staggering, really.
Yeah, it's all about having constructive conversations, right? It's everyone has their own language and preferred way to communicate, and just finding that way to communicate with them that it gets through that wall they've put up. I feel like, especially like as a patient and someone so passionate about cannabis, it's easy to kind of get up in arms with people who aren't. But I like to find what language, what way do they communicate? Like, what's going on? What's happened with you? How could you benefit? And why are you opposed to it? Could it potentially help you? Like, working through those discussions while respecting opposing opinions, because I feel like those who are in opposition are the ones we need to target the most to bring into the fold, but they need the most, patience and compassion than the people who are already, rah about the,
there's no need to preach the converted in a way, isn't it? It's
exactly. I think that's one of the things we don't see enough at trade shows, which drives me nuts, is that we'll have all these conversations about the, medical cannabis, but you almost never see any physicians at these conferences. And I feel like they'd be the ones that I'd be trying to give free tickets to and really have them there, because they're going to drive the change. We need physicians to feel comfortable discussing with their own peer groups cannabis, because I feel like a lot of the change is going to drive from the healthcare professionals, because they have to be willing to prescribe and openly discuss and research cannabis, both from a harmful and beneficial standpoint, and feel confident standing up amongst their peer groups as such.
Actually, I was going to mention there's an event I'm going to go to on 12th of May. It's Medical Cannabis Clinicians Society. It's up in Manchester. Medical cannabis, everything you need to know for doctors, students, scientists, researchers, professionals, and patients. And I thought, well, again, that seems like a good opportunity to
that's a good plug.
Well, again, I just thought it might be quite interesting.
Well,
and I'm not
perfect.
sure.
That's what we need to hear. Give me some information on that so I can share it.
Yeah, for sure, absolutely.
That's something like that we need to see more of. Like, there's I love focusing on the patients, but like if I could corner a physician and just find a way to get inside their head, especially since usually my story is so unique. You don't usually run into a one-lunged, cancer survivor. So I reel them in with that and then start talking to them about cannabis.
Yeah, well, again, if they're not prepared to listen to that, then, there's something, well, then you'll never get them, will you? If you can't sort of get them with something that powerful, it's crazy. But no, on the topic of kind of conferences and events. You're going to be at ICBC. Are we allowed to talk about that in Berlin?
Oh yeah.
We can talk about. We can say that you're going to be talking about that. So what's because that's kind of recently been announced, hasn't it? That you're going to be presenting at ICBC in Berlin. So that'd be cool. So tell us a little bit more about that. Are you going to be on a panel? You're doing a kind of individual talk, or
I'm going to be on a panel. One of my colleagues in Spain, Farida of Dovetail Consulting, she's a moderator on this panel, and I just know it's going to be one hell of a ride from what I understand. She has definitely seen some stuff in the industry. She came also from North America. She's from Canada, moved over to Spain, and has a long-standing history in cannabis. So she's seen a lot of what I've seen, but has more time over in Europe than I've had. So I'm interested to see what gets discussed. But it's a really, really great panel.
Yeah, cool. No, not sure if I'm going to get over for that yet, but it'd be interesting to, again, just more sort of voices coming from different parts of the world, or, from experience in different. I think that was kind of what I took away from the ICBC in Barcelona, just sort of getting that, because there were a lot of sort of people from North America as well as from Europe sort of coming together and sort of figuring out, well, what are the opportunities and what are the, how are we navigating this as largely as a sector, or people involved in the sector, and what
exactly.
Is it?
Yeah, building a global community. I mean, I think that's the best way, because we all have different pain points, all the situations that we're running into are vastly different, but also in so many ways the same. So being able to share information, share, wins and losses, and figure out how to overcome obstacles together.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. Cool. So what else is happening in your world in terms of, your sort of work in the sector in cannabis? Have you got any other kind of events planned, or are you doing more with your current company right now? What's the story?
So I'm doing a couple trade shows with AGI. I'll be going to Cannatrade and Burn. That's in May. And then, of course, ICBC in Berlin. Those are, I think, the most. Those are the soonest shows. I'm still contemplating MJ Biz in Vegas. Yeah. It's not until November, but it's such a big show. I didn't get to go last year, so I'm kind of considering going to that one. And then I'm also trying to just really immerse myself in learning as much as I can about the different markets over in Europe. And really understanding them, really diving into the UK. I've recently joined Please advisory board. So if you're not familiar with Plea, it's PLEA community. They do a lot for patient awareness and advocacy. And then I'm working on seeing if I can get involved anyway in supporting, or at least being a cheerleader for drug science, because I love what they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. No, I mean, from my perspective, that's just fantastic. It is such a, thank you for joining me. There's some powerful stuff there from your own personal story and from your sort of vision for how you want to sort of evolve the sector on this side of the pond, which is great. But any sort of final thoughts from you on where you think we might be heading as a, global cannabis society, as well as more specifically here in the UK? What's and do you think, what sort of timeline do you think we might be looking at for, I mean, again, it's finger in the air, but.
Yeah, it didn't dust off my crystal ball for this call. But like I said, I don't think that there can be a recreational market that's successful without a strong medical market. So I think for all of us who are passionate about cannabis, be it medically or recreationally, or just even just CBD on a wellness aspect, I think that we need to push for education and awareness, and we need to figure out how to get on the same side. And I think that needs to be a global front. So, I think best foot forward is education and awareness. Don't be afraid to share your story.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Great stuff. Thank you. Thanks, Rebecca. Really appreciate your time. So we'll catch you soon. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thanks for talking to me.